what kind of benchmarking options that you have as an organization and what the pros and cons are of each one of those. So some things that we have come across when we are looking at nonprofit organizations and trying to find benchmark market data for the jobs that you would have in your organization. There's really, some kind of hybrid options, but by and large, it comes down to closed surveys, open surveys, and then direct peer data. So I want to talk a little bit about each one of these. So the closed surveys, these would be specific for the nonprofit industry. Most of the nonprofit surveys that we see are closed surveys. What that means is that you have to pay to play. You have to submit your employee data in order to get others' employee data. Likely, and in most cases, these are either low-cost surveys or free with data submission. So once you submit your data, you get access to the tool. If you don't want to submit your data, sometimes they'll allow you to do that, and then it's just a higher cost. They are incredibly industry relevant. When you are trying to compare yourself to other nonprofit organizations, it's a clear peer, right? It makes a lot of sense from an industry standpoint. Downside is that it's not always job relevant. So you are very much limited to those survey participants and what jobs they have within their organizations that they have submitted to this survey. So we have seen, especially in very small organizations where there's people perhaps wearing a lot of hats, doing hybrid roles, sometimes these closed surveys for the nonprofit industry in particular are not as relevant because we can't find a good peer match to determine really what market pay is currently. Then you have those open survey aggregators. You have open surveys that organizations submit to, and then you have these different tools that will aggregate those surveys and put them all into a pretty database for you. So examples of this would be Comp Analyst, PayScale. They take all of the data that they receive, and then they aggregate them. They normalize the data, they perhaps age the data, and they can actually provide analytics to fill in based on these trends and statistics. The downside with these is they can be high cost. They can be cost prohibitive, but they don't require any data submission. You can provide data and usually enter it into these tools and then see how they compare. But by and large, you don't have to submit your data into any type of open survey. The third option here that is specific to the nonprofit industry is direct peer data. So as I'm sure you all know, there are additional disclosures that you need to file that have specific roles that are public knowledge. The pro of this is that you have direct peer data. You can specify exactly what organization that you want to go to and find out exactly how much their leaders make. The time investment to do that can be significant. So you would be going out looking at each one of those disclosures and documentation and trying to find those. So you can have a lot of time invested into that process. Additionally, the roles are limited to those disclosed positions. So if you are looking for, an office manager, potentially, if that office manager makes less than $100,000, they're not going to be on those in that documentation. So they are limited to the roles that are actually disclosed there. In terms of what we typically see, we will typically see a combination of all three of these with the clients that we do, that we help through this process. Usually there will be a closed survey that will be where we can find relevant data. We will utilize that. We will supplement that with an open survey aggregator. And then where there are specific roles, usually leadership roles, we will go to the direct peer data so that we can pull that as well. So no right or wrong answer here either in terms of what is the best. There's pros and cons to each, but they definitely do each have their place within the benchmarking world. One other thing I just want to add in here really quickly is that open survey aggregators, when you have an ability to look at multiple industries, you may have some roles that you're not pulling from nonprofit industries. You're also pulling from the for-profit world. You're pulling from government. You're pulling from other industries that you need to understand what you're in competition with. So one of the perks of open survey aggregators is you're getting that additional data that might not necessarily be in some of these other more specific nonprofit surveys. So let's talk about some of the considerations as you're picking what you're going to be using. So first is sample size. Who is contributing to the survey, and do they have the jobs that I have? That is first and foremost. If you go out and purchase a survey and they don't have the positions that you need, or they have 2 companies that are submitting, that's not really a sample size that is going to be relevant or statistically significant. And so if you're basing it off of that, you might want to think about adding an additional source. Industry relevance, nonprofit industry, specifically you want to know exactly what other nonprofits are paying, and then also those labor competitors. So where you are losing employees to or recruiting employees from, if it is not within the nonprofit industry, you want to try to find a benchmarking survey or market data set that is going to match that. And then location, we talked about location already. Does the survey have alternate locations? So this might not be an issue for you currently, but in the future you might want to look at it. Often for those organizations that pay without geographic difference, we see that they're still asking the question and they still want to check on a very regular basis how much it would be to go to a regional model and pay based on location. And that's because the market is changing consistently. And I'm sure that you all have seen in the last 2 years, things have changed dramatically, that there may be some shifts in how much it costs to have an employee in various different areas that might have been considered low cost. We may see a shift, or not necessarily a shift, but we might see some differences being shrunken between those high cost areas and then the low cost areas historically. So these are definitely things to keep in mind when you're looking at a benchmark survey.